Hi, Michael.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm good. Good.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast app. And you're Michael Brendan Dougherty. And how do you introduce yourself these days?
I'm a senior writer at National Review Online, whatever that means these days.
You know what I think it means? I have a theory about what it means. I think it means that Trump has had one good effect on the world. I suspect that you would not be writing for National Review had Trump not gotten elected.
I don't know. No, that's not necessarily true.
Did I say it was necessarily true? I said I think.
Maybe. I mean, maybe in sort of in a sort of, but I think the dominoes that were falling, the trail begins further behind.
Okay, but you can understand my theory, right? Because you are, I mean, I didn't even know how you voted, and I know you have certain kinds of deep reservations about Trump, especially Trump the president, perhaps more than Trump the candidate. But you, I mean, first of all, you wrote things early on that people noted demonstrated a clearer comprehension of how he had come to be and why he had a certain base of support than many people were writing, and that in turn was related to the fact that your brand of conservatism could be loosely said to be Buchananite in the sense of Pat Buchanan, right? And Trump in some ways, of course, follows up on that legacy. I'm sure there are things about him that Pat Buchanan wouldn't like, but in a broad sense, that especially, again, you might say in some ways Trump the candidate more than Trump the president, but still, that's my theory was on the basis of zero evidence. The National Review, in an attempt to remain relevant in this Trump era, looked for somebody with deep insight into the Trump phenomenon and chose you. But I just made that up. Is that not true?
Well, listen. I'll tell you how I would tell the story.
Okay.
So I come out of the larger Buchananite universe, I guess. I was at the American Conservative in 2006 for a couple of years. Broadly critical of wars, a restrictionist on immigration, and I thought I had a lot of I thought that form of politics, the Buchananite thing, was dead, and I actually thought I underrated Trump because of my convictions about that for some time. But then as he started proving durable in the primaries, I had a lot of mental, I had this huge mental library of stuff from the 90s that I could bring to bear on the moment. And there were a few other people like that, I think, that studied that were interested in those kinds of politics. I think like T.A. Frank over at Vanity Fair, not that he's a conservative, or Michael Lind. So I feel like I saw it a little earlier. I didn't vote for Trump. I didn't support him becoming president because I thought character-wise he was
You think he's lacking in the character department? I hadn't heard this.
Yeah, I think he's totally unfit, and I thought he brought, I accept that Democratic politics are rough, but I thought, I just thought he was racist.
Yeah, not to put too fine a point on it.
Associated. So I saw it earlier, but Charlie Cook, who kind of brought me over to National Review, he had been a fan and a little bit of a friend for a while. We started getting lunches before Trump won, and he was kind of laying the groundwork. And it's been a great fit. It's been nice. I did find the initial year of Trump pretty depressing in a lot of ways, though.
Many of us did.
So, I had no illusions. I didn't think I would get much of what I wanted out of it, right? You can go back in my columns for the week and find me saying there won't be a wall built. There'll probably be some kind of amnesty passed. His foreign policy will turn on public opinion. Mm-hmm. I think it's even worse than that. I think it's turning on whoever's had his ear last. If the Saudis have, then he's against Qatar in a bizarre way.
I think that's a case of Jared having his ear last. I think the Saudis are working through Jared largely, but anyway,
I'm sure some people watching this have seen me on Blogging Heads before, and I would say just at this point in my life, my politics are a little bit of this and that. That I think a healthy American society makes room for a little bit of populism, a little bit of nationalism, a little bit of liberalism. I'm trying to spread my bets these days.
Okay. Well, you have written a lot of interesting stuff for National Review, and I want to talk about your specific columns recently. But before that, I want to explore they're like bearing on the whole Facebook, Cambridge Analytica thing, and bearing on relations with Russia and the so-called demise of the so-called liberal order in international affairs.
Yeah.
So I want to get to all that, but let's explore the Trump thing a little further. I mean, I would guess that your take on Trump now is something like disappointed in the foreign policy. His foreign policy is increasingly the opposite of Buchananite, very interventionist. Maybe not, but maybe happy about some of the economic nationalist noises he's making with the tariffs, even if he's maybe executing it kind of ham-handedly, as he tends to execute things. And maybe not altogether unhappy with the immigration. I mean, there's things that the base is said to be disappointed in. He hasn't built the wall, but the fact is, he's through tighter, ICE enforcement and stuff. He's kind of sending a message. I personally, myself, have grave misgivings about approaching it that way, as opposed to, if I was going to do immigration restrictionism, I'd rather not involve instilling fear in millions of people who are already here. But but that said, he has not abandoned the immigration restrictionist thing the way he's abandoned the Buchananite foreign policy.
Yeah, and that was always predictable. In a way, every president recently has run as more dovish than they turn out to be in office. It was true for Bush. It was true for Obama. It's certainly the way I think it's the way the office shapes the occupant. Because the president has a relatively free hand as far as military intervention at this point, with the total lack of congressional oversight or interest in oversight. Maybe it's more accurate to say the congressional abdication. So that was always, I think, baked into it. And he'd always been sort of Jacksonian in his rhetoric that, okay, he's against dumb wars, but when he's for a war, he's sort of of the philosophy of rubble doesn't make trouble.
Right.
So that was always going to displease me. On immigration, I agree a bit on the immigration thing, but I would say my ideal regime of enforcement would be more workplace based, which just be enforcing the nation's labor laws in such a way that people who are here illegally that don't have a right to work here wouldn't be like afraid of being run out of the country in the dead of night from a raid, but they might lose their job and they might have to depend on working relatives who are already here, or they would be able to have time to make their own decisions for what they wanted to do next. That would be where I would start before. I don't care about the wall. I think that's symbolic and nasty in certain ways, and not really useful use of resources.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I would start. So I mean, on the one hand, I would say this: the Trump presidency has been. I mean, my worst case scenario for the Trump presidency was sort of end of the civilization, with sort of nuclear war. So on that score, we're doing really well. That it's more of a reality TV show botch from end to end. So if that's how it's going to be, fine. And if in the meantime we discredit a few kind of idols from the post-Cold War era of politics, then I'll have judged it maybe even positively.
Wait, elaborate
But I
on
mean,
that.
that's a low bar.
If we discredit what does that part mean?
Yeah, like if we dethrone a few idols about trade or like the direction of history, then it'll be worth it. You know, it's like, you know, maybe this gets more into this idea of what I was talking about, the liberal world order.
Right.
You know, what I am hoping for in the Trump years, I guess, is that the United States can take a pragmatic approach on the issues of regulating the movement of goods, capital, and people. Right? Like, I mean, that's sort of my shorthand for the post Cold War era, is this liberal dominance where you're always working towards the ever freer movement of goods, capital, and people across borders. And I think on the whole that's brought a lot of positive things, but it's not unqualified, and it shouldn't be a religion.
Right.
And have to navigate it pragmatically.
Right. And you would see Trump as largely a reaction against what that philosophy and what it's brought. I mean, at least two of the big planks: immigration restrictionism and economic nationalism can be explained.
Yeah, I mean, he's not crossing. I mean, I don't dare to dream of a conservative who complains about the financialized economy. I mean, someday maybe.
Okay. Yeah, and so you wrote this piece on kind of mocking all the liberal alarms about the demise of the liberal world order, and your point was, I mean, first of all, how much demise are we really seeing, right?
Right.
So, like, you know, there's a trade agreement we didn't join, the Pacific whatever.
Yeah, TPP.
But Bernie Sanders wasn't going to join it, and Hillary finally, under political pressure from the Bernie wing, said she wasn't going to do it. So, as you point out, nobody was going to join that if we're to take them at their word. And then I don't know. You're just saying that, you know, how much has really fallen apart. I mean, he's made some noises about NATO, but I mean, we're still in it, right? Like, so that's the kind of thing you mean, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what it is that I don't know if I'll be invited to these things anymore, but in the last year I was getting invited.
I think your goal, let me just say, if you're in Washington and you're a journalist and you're telling the truth, your goal should be to cease to be invited to all functions.
Yeah.
That would be a badge of honor.
I was getting invited to these things where you'd see these people that come out of the State Department, out of European diplomatic corps, and you know, mix of elected officials and officials that haven't been reelected, and they're worrying about, you know, the kind of the whole liberal world order. And I think these meetings are generally good and helpful. I think it is good to keep people talking. But they would tell this story of like, well, you know, after World War II, the United States had a foreign policy that did X, Y, and Z, and working together with their partners in Britain, working together with Western Europe, and we built this beautiful world. And from this world order, all of these things that will disappear if we retreat from it. and then they'll cite like 2 or 3 minor things. In my book, they're minor things, and say, the whole thing is coming down.
Mm-hmm.
And those minor things might be backing out of TPP, the Paris Climate Accords, and the rise of Viktor Orban in Hungary and Law and Justice in Poland.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the whole thing. And that story as a story is bullshit. There are much worse things that happened after World War II, between then and now, much bigger challenges. And we made it through. So, order. What has been happening in the last 2 years is just very tiny, trivial challenges to it, or problems within it. And my fear is that these kind of, pro-globalization liberals are kind of settling on a set of political doctrines that end up canceling out democracy, right? That ultimately you can't vote to put a brake on any of their program, or you're backsliding and you're going to be in the arms of Vladimir Putin within the week. And I think that's dangerous. I think defining every disagreement or dissent from elite opinion as impermissible, authoritarian, racist backlash that helps the Russians. That's kind of like the nightmare paranoia from the Cold War that I thought we were supposed to be against.
Well, right. We on the left were supposed to be against it. And that, of course, is the irony that a few people have noted. Not many, but this is something that Glenn Greenwald and people on his part of the spectrum pointed out, that it used to be the case that people who were warning against needlessly exacerbating tensions with the Russians were people on the left, and that the Cold War drumbeat came from the right. But Trump has unified the left and right in what amounts to a kind of Cold War drumbeat, because even if you don't say it's your philosophy that we should be hard on the Russians, if every time Trump fails to be hard on the Russians, you say that's just proof that he colluded with the Russians in the elections, you are putting political pressure on him to get tough with the Russians. And to some extent, I think he has, in response to that very kind of pressure. Yeah,
I think he has too. And on the other side, I do fear, and some other conservative writers fear, I do fear that some right-wingers who are kind of involved in this polarization in their own minds and lives, I do think there's the possibility some of them will become credulous about Russia or about Putinism, which is just gangsterism, as far as I'm concerned. But at the same time, I think almost every president since Reagan was elected has wanted better relations with Russia for a reason. They have a major nuclear arsenal. They are gamed. Their economy is not very good or very robust, but they have enough tanks to roll through Eastern Europe very quickly, and our allies in Europe don't have many tanks to meet them with. So, if you care about peace, that's a relationship you want to improve over the long run. I think liberals have decided that they have to do that by, essentially I think what they want in the long run is regime change in Russia. And I think that is a pipe dream at this point. And we should really put it out of our heads. And we should put it out of our heads to do regime change in Russia's, near territory, because I think that exacerbated the relationship as well. Well, you wrote so. Go ahead. No, go ahead. Well, on Russia, you wrote a good piece. It's different from your liberal world order piece, to which we may return. But you wrote a good piece on Russia that I thought
did a good job of, without endorsing Russian policy or particularly approving of their approach to world affairs, you pointed out in a way that I think is all too rare these days, how certain things look differently from the Russian perspective. From Russia's perspective, we abetted a coup in Ukraine, and Ukraine was a country that had a Russian naval facility. And if you imagine the comparable thing happening, like Russia seeming to encourage a kind of what I think in Ukraine was, in some sense, technically a forcible overthrow of a democratically elected government, however much of a sham you consider the election that led to the democratically elected government. I think in a technical, the guy fled for his life, right? I mean, he vacated so he wouldn't be killed. And you can make the case that America fostered the climate in which that happened, and that it was a Russian client state. They had a military base there. And if you imagine the same thing happening to us, we would not sit by and do nothing. We would probably intervene militarily. So too with Syria, really. Again, as you noted, Russia has a military naval facility in Syria. It's an ally, and we sponsored. We supported rebels who tried to violently overthrow the government. Now we actually have troops in there, and again, you don't have to like Russia to understand that. These are the kinds of things that we ourselves would find threatening and not take lying down. You didn't say all this, but that was the idea, right?
Right, exactly. I mean, listen, if it is like what we did in Kiev was like, the Russian, I'm trying to think of a good analogy. I mean, U.S. has always been sensitive about anything that happens in the Caribbean, for instance, right? I mean, it's so close to where we are that we consider it a major strategic imperative to have friendly governments in the Caribbean as far as practical. Could you imagine if Vladimir Putin or a major Russian political figure underneath him, Dmitry Medvedev or Sergei Lavrov, showed up in Montreal ahead of a secession vote for Quebec, and was meeting up with Quebec leaders who were looking to join an economic bloc or a security bloc that was led by the Russians.
Right.
As many Ukrainian nationalists want to join NATO. I mean, that would be a 5-alarm fire. And so, and my view is colored by the fact that I see Russia as a country that is surrounded by hostile powers and strong powers. And, historically it's had to deal with major wars with Turkey, with Japan, with Germany flying over Poland, and there are no real geographical boundaries between Russia and Germany. That's why Poland is so easy to conquer in some ways. Russia is a very unlucky geography, and because it's a land power, I think it tends to be more authoritarian than a power like Britain or America, which are built on navies, and so tend to be more liberal and more interested in trading arrangements as their projection of power. So for all those reasons, I think we have to have lower expectations of what kind of regime Russia will have. And further, I mean, we also have to be realistic. I mean, Putin probably, his government murders journalists. It acts in this nasty way, and its clientelist foreign policy strikes us as ugly. But I mean, that doesn't stop those sorts of things don't stop us from being friends with Saudi Arabia, and right. In fact doing quite nasty things at their behest.
No, absolutely.
So it's not so it can't quite be just the moral objection, unless there's something deeper going on, and I think there may be, and this is something I didn't get to in that piece. But I do wonder if the reason Russia plays this role in our psyche is because it is it is in many ways, it's a European nation. It's a Christian nation. And I think people worry that if we accept their government as legitimate, even if it's authoritarian and nasty and brutish, that somehow we may become like that in some way, or like it's admitting we may become like that, as if we have almost like lower standards for the Middle East and for.
Well, I think a fear in the context of Trump specifically of some people is that like a source of his seeming intermittent affinity for Putin is not just that that Putin has leverage over him or that they colluded together in the election, but that Trump sees a soulmate. Trump, this is the kind of ruler Trump would like to be. I think that's definitely some of the concern. I think it's actually real. I mean, I think that is a ruler. That is the kind of guy Trump would like to be.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think also Trump would like to be a president who can take a decision without consultation, the way Putin is.
Yeah, absolutely. And could kill a journalist or two.
Yeah, possibly. I maybe. I mean, on the one hand, I do kind of want to credit Trump with his fundamental unseriousness in some way.
I agree.
He is a reality star in a way. We are talking about a reality star versus a KGB agent.
No, I totally like the Stormy Daniels allegation that he had her physically threatened. I am sure that's true, and I'm also sure there would have been no follow-up. There have been several reported instances of people being physically threatened by somebody calling on behalf of Trump. I'm sure it's all true, and I suspect strongly he would never actually follow up on it. He's not, as you might put it, serious enough or something.
Yeah, I mean, listen, that's bad enough.
No, it's terrible. It's horrible. Yeah, no, it's grounds for impeachment. I mean, you shouldn't be the kind of person who has people physically threatened. You're not equipped to be president. Absolutely.
Right. So, but anyway, it just Russia plays this odd role in our imagination, and for some people, right? And like this is true for some populist figures in Europe on the populist right, and even in the American right, is they also fantasize about Putin, right? They fantasize that there is like, Putin is a leader who really stands up for Russia's national interests, right? Like Dinesh D'Souza would say, well, unlike Obama, Putin has actually stood up for Russia. There are these figures on the populist right who think that Putin is standing up for his country in a way that our leaders do not. And a sober look at it would just say that Putin gambles and messes up sometimes, and he's isolated his country economically, and that it's put a real hammer to the Russian economy. I mean, they've worked to try to work around it, and do import substitution and things like that. But, it's still not a pleasant place to live. And you can argue Putin is partly responsible for that.
Yeah. And, this, I want to move on to your Facebook Cambridge Analytical take. But first, I want to say this kind of circles back to your point about the liberal world order. There is a leftist critique. I mean, your critique of all the hand wringing about the demise of the liberal world order is A, the erosion hasn't been that significant, and B, you personally are not all that enthusiastic about aspects of the liberal world order anyway. There's a critique from the left, which is that, like, who are you kidding to act as if Democratic presidents have felt deeply constrained by international law or something, right? I mean, because you hear this, like Trump, no regard for international law. When was the last president who took international law seriously? I mean, so Bush, first of all, the invasion of Iraq, pretty clear-cut violation of international law. Obama was better in the sense that he would like to have international law on his side, and the initial intervention in Libya was thoroughly sanctioned according to the book by the United Nations. But once they moved from the short-term protection of populations to regime change, he was exceeding the mandate of the UN, and nobody. I mean, by conventional interpretation, there's people that argue that, but also just the all the drone strikes in the various countries and the we have not had a stickler for international law since I don't know, Woodrow Wilson or something.
I mean, and even then,
and even then, so it's
pretty
like
inconsistent.
So it's like, who are you kidding? And anyway, I just wanted to get that out there. That's something you hear as well.
No, it's true. International law is sort of like the United States treats it the way baseball players treat the unwritten rules of baseball. Right, like, oh, don't bunt on our shift if you're up by 7 runs.
Oh, right.
It's sort of like just a scam. Sam Miller wrote this in ESPN today, and I thought it kind of applies everywhere else. It's just like a scam you're running on other people to make them act against their own interests, but you never intend to follow them yourself. And I mean, and listen, historically, big nations break their treaty commitments freely. Right, that's what makes them big, powerful nations. It's smaller, non-powerful nations that have to, believe in these commitments.
And I'm against that, but I'm not under the illusion that Democratic presidents have been against it in a thoroughgoing way.
I mean, how is the Trump era kind of shaped? How is what we're talking about, the kind of the hysteria about the liberal world orders falling apart, the conspiracy theories that just come out endlessly about Moscow, and Trump's actual performance? I mean, how are you kind of contextualizing all that? I mean, has it changed your views on anything? Has it intensified your politics in one way or another?
I wouldn't say it's changed my views fundamentally. As far as where I stand, I am anti-Russian alarmism. I mean, it's not that I'm convinced that there was not collusion or anything else. I'm agnostic on that point. I mean, we'll find out soon enough. I think Mueller's got a lot of evidence, and we'll see what the case is. But I think in the meanwhile, first of all, too much conspiracy theorizing reminds me of Joseph McCarthy, who I thought we didn't like, and too much like accusing people of nefarious foreign influence that we actually can't document yet, and that kind of thing. But also, I think it's having a very unfortunate effect on foreign policy in the way I've already described. I don't think we need, given the problems we need to solve, like in Syria, I don't think we need to exacerbate tensions with Russia needlessly. Now, you're right. They've done horrible things. The assassination was a horrible thing. That said, we have had people assassinated. Our close allies have had people assassinated, and we've said nothing. I'm not sure it's, anyway, that's my view on that. I mean, as far as, I'm more alarmed as far as I'm not as surprised as some people, I would say. I wasn't like, born like an East Coast elite or anything. I have a different background.
Right.
I 3 of my 4 siblings voted for Trump. I was a little surprised by that, to be honest, but it tells you that I'm not completely removed from the cultural milieu, and so but I'm a little, I guess what I would say surprised me. It's not that someone could play the emotional cards that he played to get elected, like what I would call Islamophobia and in certain respects xenophobia. And by the way, I think you can be an immigration restrictionist without being a xenophobe. I think there are principled arguments, but I think he did play those kind of emotional cards. None of that really surprises me. The kind of thing that surprises me, like if you had told me that he could get up there and make fun of a disabled person so obviously and get elected, but when you see how that was processed on the other side, there's a lot of supporters who are convinced that that's not what he was doing. They did a good post, job of kind of creating a potential alternative narrative as to what he was doing there. I know it's hard to believe they believe it, but they do. And that's the kind of thing where if you had told me, I guess I would say, I thought that I think I understood how the basic kind of cultural divisions in America, the cultural diversity, the diversity of opinion, all these issues. I thought there was more in the way of a consensus as to what an asshole is, right? I mean, I thought like me and my conservative friends would look at Trump and go, and in a way, here's one way to put it. There's a lot of conservative people who, or at least there used to be, maybe this is a little bit of a generational thing, but like, they don't like end zone dances in football. They don't like the self-celebration. They remember the days when a baseball player would hit a home run and not stop to admire it because that was bad form. And you had to just trot around the bases with due respect for the pitcher, or he would throw at your head next time, right? Remember those days?
Right, yeah.
And I thought that conservatives did not, as at least as much as liberals, just didn't like a guy who's so obviously egotistical and full of himself and a showboat, and so devoid of the slightest hint of humility. I was wrong about that. I mean, I still don't understand where I got that one wrong.
I mean, I think, listen, I agree with you. The cultural changes too are bewildering to me. I mean, like, have you seen, lots of people are talking about the television premiere of Roseanne?
Yeah,
right?
I haven't seen it, but yeah.
I haven't seen it either. I probably won't watch it. I mean, when that show came on television, I was a kid. I wasn't allowed to watch it because I lived in a liberal household, and it was that television show was crass, right? It was vulgar,
right?
And you didn't want your kids watching it. You didn't, and now, right? And it was considered transgressive in some way, and now it's culturally it's like flipped to the other side somehow, and now it's like conservatives are rallying around this show. I don't know. I mean, it is bizarre. I think what a lot of conservatives did as voters was they had a lot of strategies for compartmentalizing, or for saying, well, the other side is, excused this or that piece of behavior from Clinton or from Obama or whatever. So if I don't excuse it in Trump, I'm surrendering, right? Like, I'm laying down my arms in the culture war, and I'm just going to get screwed. And, a lot of conservatives are going to come away, I think, because Trump, in a way that Bush didn't do, and in a way that Reagan didn't do, because Trump has basically entirely outsourced appointing judges to social conservatives and the Federalist Society. I think a lot of them are going to think we got a good trade. I mean, the country may be going to hell in my book in some ways. Like our civil fabric, our sense of ourselves as a cohesive nation may be dissipating entirely. But I think a lot of conservatives will feel like, hey, they were going to come after our churches, they were going to come after our religious schools, our home schools, and by electing Trump, we delayed that project by 4, 8, 20 years, something like that.
Well, I think it points to how nice it would be if people on the, left in the broad sense, center and left of center, worked harder to understand what the fears are that are out there, because it's fears he did ultimately, in one sense or another, play on. And I guess this is an opportunity to plug my newsletter, the Mindful Resistance newsletter, available at mindfulresistance.net, where we try to each week present, first of all, just kind of a fairly balanced, non-hysterical view of the news and Trump, but also we have not done a good enough job of this, but try to help people understand the way information is being processed on the other side of the tribal divide. I think it's always a good thing for people to have that kind of understanding when it's available. Yeah,
it's very difficult. I mean, in one way, I try to be, so you bring up the word mindful, and that kind of occasions a thought over here, which is I try to be mindful that in some ways the intensity of our culture war domestically is in some ways, it probably is part and parcel of the fact that we are a nation that is not under any military threat or challenge from the outside whatsoever. Mm-hmm. we have war, we have lots of wars, but in a way, it's almost like a testament to how lucky Americans are, right? That we can kind of have this constant and intense fight about our own values, right? And it's partly because we're secure enough to do that. And in some ways, as much as I find the culture war exhausting and personally threatening, to read the news, as I think everyone does at times, that is sensitive, and sort of everyone who has a sense of slippery slopes, I think, reads the news and thinks, my God, what would the other side do to me if I didn't oppose them? But I do think, when we don't have these culture wars, we'll miss them. They'll have been a sign that, like, we were working out our differences mostly peacefully, and through the ballot box and through a constant propaganda war in the media.
So you mean when it gets to the point that we're not even arguing with each other about it?
Yeah, I mean, there will come a time, I don't believe in, millennia of peace, right? So, like, at some point, American power will either be reduced or American civil peace will cease to exist. And at that point,
either American power, you mean like abroad, will be reduced?
I mean, like, American power even at home, right? Like, I mean, like, there could come a time where, America goes through, like, what Russia did in the 1990s, where it has an incredibly weak state and a society that's really crumbling. And at that point, we'll kind of long for the days when cultural power is worth fighting over. Yeah. Yeah,
we'll be too busy coping with that.
Well, coping with that, or it could be. I mean, this is way far off, in kind of an imaginative future. But I mean, war or civil unrest on the American continent in some way. That would also make us appreciate these days a little bit more.
Yeah,
we'll long for stupid Russia conspiracy theorists on Twitter.
Yeah. So speaking of that, and certainly of intra-American tribalism, I did, before we go, want to touch on this piece you wrote about kind of Facebook, Cambridge Analytica. And first of all, you brought up something I didn't know at all, and I assume it's true, but you said that actually, the thing that the Cambridge Analytica did, which was basically it got access to tens of millions of people's kind of Facebook data, not their password and stuff, but their kind of their likes, their dislikes, their basic ID and everything. It got access to that without them ever giving permission, and it got that access through a few 100,000 people who said, yeah, you can look at my friends, you can use me as a conduit to my friends. Now I had not heard this at all, but you said that the Obama campaign did something very similar in that they, I gather, approached people that they knew were supporters on Facebook and said, hey, can you help us out and give us access to your friends? But there was very much the same kind of magnifier effect you're saying. In other words, you get the access to the information of tens of millions of people who didn't give you permission by asking for permission from a much smaller number of their friends.
Right, exactly. What both Cambridge Analytica and Obama for America did was they gained access to the tens of millions of accounts, basically through the terms of service, right? So it's like when you sign up for Facebook and you don't read the big terms of service, at that time it meant that someone who, an app that your friend uses on Facebook might be able to get your data. And both Cambridge Analytica and Obama for America used that mechanism to scoop up data. And that's in fact that is what Facebook is built to do. That was what was attractive about it as a business proposition. You could say that the Cambridge Analytica did something more fraudulent in that they induced people to hand over these permissions with like a personality quiz, and they told Facebook they were doing it under the the original researcher was doing it under the pretense of some kind of social research, whereas the Obama campaign was explicitly showing itself to be a campaign.
Right.
But the Obama campaign also did it on a much larger scale, more effectively, and then they used those connections more effectively in that they would like present a Facebook supporter with like a, hey, nudge your friends to get out and vote, or nudge your friends who we believe aren't registered to vote to register to vote. And the Obama campaign was combining that data in a very sophisticated way with other public sources of personal data. And you can look back at the journalism from 2012, and they say, the Obama campaign was basically saying, we think we can identify every single person who voted for us in 2008. And so, I think part of that story, I think part of what was driving the anger at Cambridge Analytica is, of course, this looking for an outside actor to blame for Trump and for Brexit. That's obviously imperative for people who think that like this only could have happened through some conspiracy. But it's also, I think, it's anger at the fact that, Facebook and these young tech companies are supposed to be, in our imagination, they're supposed to be progressive. They're supposed to be young companies that attract young talent, and it's the future. They're making the future possible, and their political valence was supposed to be like, we're powering these young Iranian liberals to rise up against their regime of theocratic fascism. But it ain't, in the past 4 years, in fact, the average age of a Facebook user has gone way, way up. And in fact, like Facebook's actual user base is much older and more conservative. And so when you look at their effect on the election in 2016, it's not necessarily as like this liberating force for a progressive future anymore. So I think those are the two things that kind of psychologically made this Cambridge Analytica story really pop, when in fact Cambridge Analytica looks like a not very competent, digital advertising startup.
Yeah.
That was selling like all this. They were selling this conspiracy stuff to kind of get money out of rich Republicans, right? Is like, oh, well, we can do all this amazing psychographic analysis. I mean, that's just bullshit.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think as for distinctions between what the Obama campaign did and what Trump did, it seems there are some. I would guess that the Obama in the Obama case, the people who said yes, you can have access to my friends, actually kind of knew what they were doing, as opposed to just clicking yes so that they can take this stupid test.
Yes.
But I think you're right that, and there's other differences, like in the second case where they say yes, you can contact my friends with get out the vote messages. They know what they're doing, and that's that. And that, but I think you're right that there clearly was more of a hunger in the media and among the people who get their information from the media to hear that Trump had or his campaign had done something wrong. That's a pretty pervasive force these days, I think, in media coverage, and it's an interesting story in its own right. The way I think in a way that they've always said, well, the New York Times is kind of liberal, the Washington Post is kind of liberal, but I think they're closer now to being part of a movement than they used to be. And it's like when the New York Times runs a piece that's about this neo-Nazi somewhere in America, let's look at like what his social milieu is like, why he is a not blah, 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 which I personally think is a commendable thing. I think we should try to understand why bad things happen. But they caught a kind of flack for that, and I think they kind of apologized, which I thought was silly. I mean, it was a kind of flack you get if you're part of an ideology, not if you're a newspaper. I mean, it was weird. And but anyway, that to get back to this, there clearly is a hunger to pin stuff on Trump. I think I think Trump, one thing he's been is just bad for, in that sense, he's been bad for journalism. He's been good for journalism in the sense that more people are willing to pay for it.
Yes.
They're willing to pay for it because they think it's anti-Trump, and so it has to. It is incentivized to be more anti-Trump.
Well, I think National Review is doing well too, even if we're in this. So there's kind of this rumor going around on the internet in right-wing circles that National Review is finished and uninfluential and in financial trouble because it was out of step in the Trump era. And that's not true at all. I think, though, it's not just people who are anti-Trump that are interested in news. I think there's a sense of like more and more life has been colonized by the political and political thought. And so anything offering insight into that has more purchase than usual. And in some ways that's lamentable, right? Like, you should be able to buy like an arts journal and just read about art and not necessarily about like Russia and Trump.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think one thing in one case, I want to forgive some of the anti-Trump hysteria, because I do sympathize with this sense that a lot of people have who oppose him, who kind of like just look at the news and their jaw drops and they think the facts of this man should have been enough to stop him, right? Just the facts that we can all agree on, right? How was that not enough to prevent him from becoming president? And so naturally, if those aren't enough, you're going to look for the next set of facts that are even more incriminating, and that they might look more believable to you, because you can't believe that a guy who called Mexicans rapists and had a video, an audio recording of him talking about abusing women. Like, you can't believe that guy became president. Mm-hmm. So, maybe there's some conspiracy, or maybe, I think people's sense of the world has really been altered. The sense of what's possible.
Yeah, so. in a scary way in my case. And I want to say, I mean, I've said, I think for the media to become kind of just so kind of determinedly anti-Trump is not a healthy thing. And I've said, I think that the so-called resistance is overdoing the Russia thing and so on. I want to emphasize, I think, he's an I consider him a national emergency. I mean, I think he's a clear and present danger to what America aspires to be. But I just think that those things actually impede confronting the threat in an intelligent and I guess you would say mindful way. Well,
and also, I mean, listen, part of what he is threatening about him, and this is what I wrote right after the election, or right at the time of the inauguration, right? Like, one of the threats he presents, I think, has always been that people will imitate him, right? And not just people that share his politics, but even other people will kind of say, like, well, this is what it succeeds in American democracy now, is demagoguery and fear-mongering and so on. And so you're naturally kind of drawn to that, right? I mean, the Lord Acton phrase about power corrupts, I mean, that was not about the occupant in the office, right? It was that, when you have a source of power, it corrupts everything else around it, right? Because everyone is trying to get in on that power.
Yeah.
And so I think we are seeing that. And it is interesting you say about journalism, like that piece about the Nazi, like, I remember years ago I wrote a New York Times magazine piece about like the prosperity gospel, and just like an impressionistic piece about probably one of the most vulgar prosperity gospel preachers in a black church in around Norfolk, Virginia, kind of at the depth of the economic depression, and really people that were hard up on their luck, giving this rich pastor more money. And I wrote that piece with, I did the same thing that the writer of that Nazi piece did, which was I withheld as much judgment as possible. I showed you every possible light I could in the short thing that I had, this impressionistic thing about, this one particular guy who was giving his last $60, that he had in cash, and who seemed to be getting something spiritual out of it, even as, a fair-minded reader might conclude that, he's getting ripped off by a charlatan. And, no one wrote to me and said, like, I was normalizing the religious robbery of people. Right? No one did that. And so, I wonder why in some ways, like.
Well, I mean, I think in general, of course, I don't know when this was, but of course the online world and then social media in particular have just accelerated the feedback on stuff you do generally, in public, including journalistic writing. You get the feedback sooner. It can be more voluminous. There's that. But I think it's also that, and of course, I mean, there are people who would point out that maybe neo-Nazis are more dangerous than prosperity gospel preachers. But I think it's also true we're some of this is energized by the Trump moment, by a reaction which I think is itself valid, which is that this is he's a scary phenomenon, and we don't want to aid and abet him. I just we're living in intense times.
Do you think, so here's this for a thought, bringing in Facebook again. Do you think, in a sense, that the intensity of fear and loathing kind of that's extant from the culture war, do you think in some ways it's the product of the fact that our communications technology has kind of disintermediated political debate from the national and communal and territorial and ideological camps that it used to be conducted in, right? That, 25 years ago, you would subscribe to, if you're an interested news reader, intelligent, engaged citizen, you went to college, so you get the newspaper, you read a national newspaper like the New York Times or the Washington Post, you read a local newspaper, maybe a news weekly magazine, and maybe if you're really, really engaged, you read something like The Nation or the New Republic or National Review.
Mm-hmm.
And those things come to your house because you subscribe to them and you paid for them, and you feel like you're getting, that your view of the world is in some ways being refined and affirmed in the world that you live in. And what we have now is everyone is shouting at everyone in a free-for-all on social media, right? Like, the people that you wouldn't have solicited for their political views 25 years ago, you just see them now.
That's an interesting, and it's ironic. If I understand you correctly, it's that, the standard story about information technology is that it has segmented us. It has tribalized us ideologically. But if like the ideology is represented like left and right, and what you're saying is that if you look at the vertical dimension, in other words, the continuum from people who don't think much about politics to people who think about it a lot and debate it a lot, that there's actually more continuity of conversation along that dimension. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, there's continuity, and there's also I think there's also, like, if you could listen in all the time, like if you're a conservative, right, and let's say, I had one group of cousins in the early 90s who were like really conservative compared to my family, which was more liberal, and we would just not talk about politics when those families
Mm-hmm.
got together.
Mm-hmm.
But if like those conservatives who are like excited about the idea that Dan Quayle might run for president after George H.W. Bush, right? Like, if they were listening in on the conversations being had by, readers of The Nation or In These Times or something like that, I think they would feel more threatened than they did at the time, when they're just kind of listening to their own thing and reading the local newspaper. And then everyone is having kind of conversations in reference to the mainstream media, the broadcast, CBS.
I mean, are you saying there are more people who are actually in some sense engaged in the political conversation than used to be?
I'd say there's more people are engaged, and they are exposed to much more in a much less controlled manner.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's like, we actually, what's interesting is like the theory of the internet has been, oh, well, we're all choosing what information we filter in. I actually think it's almost the opposite, that we're bombarded with so much information that we wouldn't have otherwise gotten. And then we have to choose what to believe and how to react in that environment. And it's actually much more stressful. It's much more threatening. It feels much more threatening. And it's just much more disorienting for most people, especially the people that are most engaged.
Right. And I mean, if you combine the two views, I mean, if there's an overlap of the two views, the one you said was the conventional view of the internet and the one you're putting forth, I think the overlap part is that a lot of the troubling news you're being exposed to from this alternative ideology or whatever, it's being transmitted by people in your tribe. So a lot of it comes with their spin on it, with your tribe's spin on it, which often amounts to it sounding as alarming as possible.
Right, exactly. Yes, exactly. So, it's, I think, I just think that that's a big part of it, is that there's like this glut of information, and that so the filters are gone, and I think that's what's leading to this intensity of feeling where almost every single ideological, religious, racial grouping feels in some way like they're under siege in a particular way. And they're constantly fighting about whether that's true or not of their group or another.
We're all oppressed now. We're all aggrieved now. So that makes sense and is not encouraging, but it's food for thought. So thank you for taking the time. Also, I should thank you for you wrote a nice review of my book, Why Buddhism is True, many months ago now. It was early autumn, I guess, in National Review. Thank you for that. It was really very not just sympathetic. I mean, we always like sympathetic reviews, but it was very subtle. I mean, it was I thank you.
Well, I tried to actually I read the book.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying, is like, unlike many reviews, even including some favorable reviews, right? It's not always the case. I mean, of course, when you get a negative review, you say, oh, well, they didn't read the book. But sometimes with favorable reviews, it's like, oh, they didn't read the book. This was a favorable review where you read the book. So thank you.
You're welcome. It's a good book.
And congratulations on all the stuff in National Review. You've really added, I mean, you're a very good addition to The Voice from their point of view. That was a smart hire, and people should read you, because it's different from what they will read on either side of the tribal divide, as the two tribes are conventionally conceived. I think that's what I think.
Hopefully. Okay,
so let's do this again down the road, and I really appreciate it. We'll see you.
All right, thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.